October 1943. Camp Ruston, Louisiana. The heat is heavy, wet, and foreign to the men stepping off the train. They are veterans of the Africa Corps, gaunt, sunburned, and silent. Their uniforms are faded, stained with the dust of Tunisia, and their minds are filled with the warnings of their superiors. The Americans are gangsters. The Americans are starving. The Americans will execute you. They are marched not to a firing squad, but to a long, wooden mess hall. The air inside does not smell of fear or unwashed bodies. It smells of grease and animal fat. The line moves quickly. A young Gefreiter, his ribs showing through his tunic, holds out a metal tray. An American cook drops a heavy ladle onto it. Mashed potatoes, green beans, a thick slab of pork, and on the side, a slice of pure white bread. The German soldier freezes. He stares at the meat, then at the guard, waiting for the cruel joke to end. He is waiting for the price. But the line just pushes him forward. He is holding more calories on a single tray than he has seen in a month of combat. This is not a reprieve. To the indoctrinated mind, this is a terrifying display of logistical omnipotence. To understand the paralyzing shock felt by those men in the Louisiana mess hall, one must first understand the hollowed-out world they left behind. By late 1943, the Third Reich was starving its way to defeat. The image of the invincible, well-fed Aryan supersoldier, projected so effectively in the newsreels of 1940, had dissolved into a grim struggle for calories. In the frozen trenches of the Eastern Front and the scorching sands of North Africa, the Wehrmacht's logistical spine was snapping. The standard German field ration, theoretically sufficient, had become a fiction. Soldiers were surviving on Kommissbrot, a dark, dense bread often stretched with sawdust or potato flour, and ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns or barley. Meat was a memory. Fresh fruit was a rumor. The blockade of Europe was slowly strangling the Axis powers, and every ounce of high-grade protein was reserved for the pilots of the Luftwaffe or the elites of the SS, leaving the average infantryman to fight on an empty stomach. But physical hunger was only half the equation. The German soldier was also starving for truth. Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine had spent years constructing a very specific, terrifying image of the United States. Since the 1929 stock market crash, the Nazi narrative painted America not as the land of plenty, but as a broken, mongrel nation ravaged by the Great Depression. In the barracks, political officers drilled a singular message into the troops: the Americans are desperate. They are gangsters. Their cities are slums, their people are rioting for bread, and their army is an undisciplined mob. The propaganda went further, specifically targeting the fear of capture. German soldiers were told that Allied prisoner camps were death traps. They were warned that if they surrendered, they would be stripped, beaten, and left to rot in open fields, or worse, shipped to Jewish-controlled camps to be worked to death in revenge for the policies of the Reich. This was not just rhetoric. It was a survival mechanism for the regime. If the average soldier believed that surrender meant starvation, he would fight to the last bullet. This conditioning was absolute. When the Axis front collapsed in Tunisia in May 1943, a disaster, the Germans bitterly called Tunisgrad, over 275,000 Axis soldiers surrendered in a matter of days. This was a catastrophe of numbers. The Allies, already stretched thin trying to supply their own advancing armies, suddenly found themselves responsible for an army of prisoners the size of the population of a mid-sized city. The holding cages in North Africa were temporary, dusty, and overwhelmed. Water was scarce. The heat was blistering. For the German prisoners, these initial conditions seemed to confirm everything Goebbels had told them. They sat in the sand, crowded and thirsty, watching British and American trucks roar past. They expected the worst. They prepared themselves for the firing squads or the slow death of malnutrition. They did not know that a massive administrative gear was turning on the other side of the Atlantic. The United States Army Provost Marshal General Archer L. Lurch was not planning executions. He was planning a logistical miracle. The Allies needed to clear the combat zones of prisoners to free up resources for the invasion of Italy and eventually France. They couldn't feed them in the shattered landscape of North Africa, and they couldn't keep them in England, which was already functioning as a massive, overcrowded aircraft carrier. The solution was simple, yet staggering in scale: ship them to America. Use the Liberty ships returning empty from Europe to carry the enemy back to the States. For the German soldier, the order to board the transport ships was the final nail in the coffin. As they climbed the gangways, leaving the solid ground of Africa for the unpredictable Atlantic, many believed they were sailing to their executions. They huddled in the holds of the ships, listening to the creak of steel and the roar of the ocean, clutching their meager possessions. They were defeated men, leaving a starving continent, heading toward a nation they believed was equally broken. They had no concept of the abundance that was waiting for them, or the strange, strictly legalistic philosophy that governed their captors. The crossing of the Atlantic was a journey through the valley of the shadow of death, but with a twisted irony. The Liberty ships carrying the prisoners were sailing through waters infested by the Kriegsmarine. German U-boat commanders hunting in wolf packs were torpedoing Allied tonnage at a ferocious rate. The prisoners in the hold lived in terror that their own countrymen would send them to the bottom of the ocean. For 2 weeks, the silence of the sea was broken only by the thrum of engines and the occasional terrifying alarm of a destroyer's sonar ping. Then came the first shock. As the convoys approached the American coast, Boston, New York, Norfolk, the German prisoners braced themselves for the sight of the ruined America Goebbels had promised. Instead, they saw skylines that defied belief. In Europe, cities were blacked out, huddled in darkness to hide from RAF bombers. But here, the American coast was ablaze with light. Neon signs flickered, car headlights streamed along coastal highways, and the harbors were choked not with wreckage, but with pristine, newly launched ships. One German officer, captured in Tunisia, later recalled staring at the New York skyline from the deck of his transport ship. He didn't say a word. He simply turned to his fellow prisoners and whispered, "We have lost." He hadn't even set foot on the pier yet, but the sheer industrial vitality of the enemy was undeniable. Once ashore, the processing began. It was efficient, impersonal, and shockingly hygienic. Men who had spent months covered in desert lice and filth were stripped, showered, deluged with DDT powder, and issued fresh clothing. It wasn't the ragged prison stripes they expected. They were given denim work fatigues, often stamped with PWI on the back, but the cloth was new, sturdy, and warm. Then came the train ride inland. The United States Army had established a vast archipelago of internment camps, mostly in the South and Southwest, Texas, Mississippi, Louisiana, Oklahoma. The logic was practical. The climate was warm, saving on heating fuel, and the isolation reduced the risk of sabotage. But the driving force behind their treatment was not geography, it was law. The United States was a signatory to the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. The War Department, led by Secretary of War Henry Stimson, took a strictly pragmatic view of this document. They knew thousands of American airmen and GIs were currently sitting in stalags inside the Third Reich. The logic was a calculated exchange. If we treat your men according to the rules, you will have no excuse to mistreat ours. Article 11 of the Geneva Convention was the pivot point. It stated clearly, the food ration of prisoners of war shall be equivalent in quantity and quality to that of the depot troops. This legal sentence was the key to the entire psychological collision that was about to happen. Depot troops referred to soldiers stationed at bases in the rear, not on the front lines. In the German army, rear echelon troops ate modestly. In the United States Army of 1943, however, the depot ration was a nutritional juggernaut. It was designed to bulk up farm boys into fighting men. It included 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day, heavy on meat, dairy, vegetables, and sugar. Because the U.S. Army was obsessed with standardization and legal adherence, there was no separate starvation menu for prisoners. The Quartermaster Corps simply applied the standard logistical template to the camps. If a camp held 5,000 men, the supply requisition was automatically generated based on the standard soldier's diet. So, as the trains rattled into the deep American interior, passing endless fields of corn and wheat that stretched to the horizon, the German prisoners were being delivered into a system that was legally obligated to overfeed them. They were entering a world where the problem wasn't a lack of food, but a lack of storage space for the surplus. They were about to step off the train and face a reality that would shatter their worldview more effectively than any artillery barrage. For the individual German soldier, the collision with American abundance was not political. It was biological. The transition was violent. Men who had survived for months on dried biscuits and watered-down soup suddenly found themselves seated before trays loaded with proteins and fats. The first few weeks in the camps were marked by a widespread medical phenomenon, mass gastrointestinal distress. The camp doctors, often American officers assisted by captured German medics, recorded thousands of cases of severe cramps and nausea. The reason was simple: the prisoners' stomachs had shrunk. Their digestive enzymes had adjusted to a starvation diet. When suddenly bombarded with scrambled eggs, bacon, and whole milk, their bodies rebelled. But once the initial sickness passed, the psychological impact set in. The most potent symbol of this new reality was the bread. To a German, bread was a sacred cultural staple. In the Wehrmacht, they ate a heavy, dark rye. By 1943, this had become a crumbling, sour mixture filled with extenders. In the American camps, the bread was white. To the prisoners, the standard U.S. Army loaf looked like cake. It was soft, blindingly white, and essentially crustless. Many prisoners initially refused to eat it, convinced it was raw dough or some chemical substitute. When they finally tasted it, they were stunned by the sweetness. And it wasn't just the bread, it was what went on it. In the Reich, butter was rationed by the gram. In Mississippi, great bowls of butter sat on the mess tables, unmonitored. Prisoners watched in disbelief as American guards casually scraped half-eaten pats of butter into the garbage. To a man who had watched comrades die for a tin of sardines, this casual waste was more intimidating than a tank division. It signaled a society so resource-rich that it could afford to throw away what Europe was killing for. Inside the barracks, a silent, vicious war began to brew over the dinner tables. The camps were not monolithic. They were divided between the weary, non-political conscripts and the hardcore Nazi ideologues, the 150%ers, as the Americans called them. For the Nazi officers and the SS men mixed into the general population, the American menu was a threat. It contradicted the core tenet of their worldview, that the Aryan race was superior and the American democracy was weak and failing. How could a degenerate nation feed its prisoners better than the Führer fed his own troops? The hardliners launched a counteroffensive of rumors. They whispered down the bunk rows that the food was a trick. The Americans are fattening us up, they claimed. They will parade us for photos to show the world how well they treat us, and then they will ship us to the Yukon to freeze or hand us over to the Bolsheviks. Some fanatical officers went as far as forbidding their men from eating certain items, claiming the white bread was poisoned or drugged to make them docile. There were documented instances in camps like Camp Hernon in Texas, where Nazi camp police would stand by the garbage cans, watching to see who was enjoying the American food too much. To enjoy the enemy's steak was seen as a lack of discipline, a spiritual betrayal of the suffering fatherland. But as the weeks turned into months and the poisoning never happened, the ideological dam began to crack. The smell of frying pork was a more persuasive argument than any speech Goebbels had ever written. From the American perspective, this abundance was simply a matter of standard operating procedure. The United States was in the middle of an agricultural explosion. While Europe's fields were churned into mud by tank tracks, American farms were producing record harvests, the USAIS. Government was buying up surplus meat, corn, and dairy to stabilize prices. The Quartermaster Corps had a rigid, almost robotic adherence to the master menu. This menu was designed to deliver 3,500 to 4,000 calories a day to a soldier in training. It rotated through specific meals: roast beef on Tuesdays, chicken on Sundays, frankfurters and beans, chili con carne, stew. Camp commanders, mostly older officers or those unfit for combat duty, followed these regulations to the letter. They were bureaucrats, not crusaders. If the regulation said 18 ounces of meat per man per day, then 18 ounces of meat were delivered. There was a surreal disconnect in the paperwork. German kitchen staff, used to meticulously weighing every gram of potato peelings to ensure nothing was wasted, would come to the American supply officers in a panic, claiming they had been sent too much food. They would try to return crates of oranges or sides of beef, thinking it was a clerical error. The American supply sergeants, annoyed by the paperwork, would simply wave them away. Cook it or throw it out was the standard response. This administrative apathy was the ultimate power move. The United States didn't need to starve its prisoners to save money. It didn't need to ration. It fed the enemy better than the enemy fed itself, simply because it was too much trouble to change the paperwork. By 1944, the dynamic shifted again. The United States was suffering from a critical labor shortage. Millions of fighting-age men were overseas, leaving American fields ready for harvest with no one to pick the crops. The solution was sitting idle in the camps. Under the Geneva Convention, non-officer prisoners could be compelled to work, provided the work was not dangerous or directly related to the war effort. Suddenly, the Wehrmacht was deployed to the American Corn Belt. This created one of the most surreal social experiments of the 20th century. Hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had burned villages in Ukraine, found themselves riding in the back of pickup trucks with elderly farmers in Kansas, Nebraska, and Minnesota. The collision of cultures occurred over the midday meal. While the prisoners were supposed to eat army rations, American farmers operated by a different code. To them, if a man worked your land, you fed him. There are countless recorded instances of farmers' wives setting up long tables under the shade of oak trees, laden with fried chicken, fruit pies, corn on the cob, and pitchers of iced tea. The German soldiers, initially wary, were baffled by this hospitality. They were the enemy. They were killing these women's sons in Italy and France. Yet, here they were, being served second helpings of rhubarb pie. This table diplomacy dissolved the Nazi caricature of the American devil. It was impossible to maintain a hate-filled ideology when the gangster enemy was a 60-year-old farmer asking if you wanted more gravy. The abundance of the American farm, combined with the casual decency of the rural population, did more to deprogram the German soldier than any official re-education course. They realized that the Jewish-controlled, chaotic mob described by Goebbels was actually a disciplined, highly religious, and incredibly wealthy society of producers. Inside the camps, the abundance created a bizarre microeconomy. Prisoners were paid for their labor, 80 cents a day in canteen script coupons. In the context of the camp, this was a fortune. The camp canteens, PXs, were stocked with goods that had virtually vanished from Europe. Prisoners could buy chocolate, cigarettes, beer, toiletries, and even Coca-Cola. In Germany, a pack of American cigarettes was a currency worth its weight in gold, traded on the black market for favors or survival. In the Texas camps, German prisoners were smoking a pack a day. The Golden Cage, as the prisoners called it, became a place of confusing comfort. They organized soccer leagues, theater troupes, and orchestras. At Camp Crossville in Tennessee, the prisoners built such an elaborate garden and aquarium that locals would drive out on Sundays just to look at it through the wire. But the food remained the central anchor of their reality. It became the primary subject of their letters home. When prisoners wrote to their families in Hamburg or Berlin, the censors often had to intervene, not to stop military secrets, but to stop the descriptions of dinner. The American commanders feared that if the German families knew how well the prisoners were eating, it might be used by Nazi propaganda to claim the prisoners had turned traitor. Or, conversely, the German families simply wouldn't believe it. One prisoner wrote, "Dear Mother, today we had roast turkey, sweet potatoes, and cranberry sauce. It was difficult to finish." In a Germany where the mother was likely boiling potato skins for soup, such a letter read like a hallucination. The disconnect was total. The prisoner was living in a land of plenty, while the victor was starving. The psychological dismantling of the German soldier did not happen in an interrogation room. It happened through the window of a Pullman train car. After the initial processing at the ports of entry, New York, Norfolk, Boston, the prisoners were loaded onto trains destined for the permanent camps in the interior. This journey was the moment the scale of the war truly landed. In Europe, travel was measured in hours. A soldier could cross a country in a day. The geography was dense, historical, and claustrophobic. But as the prisoner trains chugged west, leaving the eastern seaboard, the German troops prepared themselves for a short trip. They assumed the United States was a nation of coastal cities with a hollow interior. They traveled for a day, then another, then a third. The landscape outside the windows shifted from the dense forests of the east to the endless, rolling plains of the Midwest, and finally to the stark, terrifying vastness of the Southwest. For the men of the Wehrmacht, this was a geographical shock that no map could convey. They stared out at millions of acres of wheat, corn, and soy that rolled by for hours without interruption. There were no bomb craters. There were no burned-out husks of tanks. There were no sirens wailing in the distance. There was only peace and an industrial capacity that seemed infinite. The climactic realization often centered on the infrastructure. The German army relied heavily on horses for logistics. The Wehrmacht used over 7 million horses in World War II. They were a modern army with a pre-industrial logistical tail. As they watched the American landscape pass by, they saw highways running parallel to the train tracks, and those highways were full. They saw trucks, thousands of them. Not just military convoys, but civilian delivery trucks, tankers, and flatbeds hauling steel and lumber. They saw civilian cars gleaming with chrome, driven by women, teenagers, and factory workers. To the German mind, conditioned by years of fuel rationing where a private car was a luxury for the highest party officials, this was incomprehensible. A famous anecdote recounts a German major traveling through Missouri. He watched a traffic jam on a highway next to the rail line. He turned to the American guard and asked, "Where are all these people going? Is there an evacuation?" The guard laughed and shook his head. "No, buddy. It's Saturday. They're going to the ball game." The major collapsed back into his seat. The implication was devastating. The United States was fighting a two-ocean global war, supplying Britain and Russia, and yet its civilian population still had enough gasoline and rubber to drive to a baseball game on a Saturday. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Germany wasn't just losing the war, it was being crushed by a society that hadn't even fully exerted itself yet. The view from the train window destroyed the gangster myth. Goebbels had painted America as a chaotic mess of racial tension and poverty. But the prisoners saw factories in Ohio and Michigan that stretched for miles, blazing with light 24 hours a day. They saw workers pouring into shipyards in numbers that dwarfed the population of German towns. They saw a nation that was not only unbombed, but was actually growing richer and stronger as the war progressed. For the die-hard Nazis on the train, this visual evidence was a crisis of faith. They tried to claim it was a trick, that the Americans were driving the same cars in circles to fool them, or that the train was driving through a movie set. But the sheer duration of the journey made the denial impossible. You could not fake a 3-day train ride across 1,500 miles of fertile farmland. The climax of their defeat occurred in this silence. It was the moment the prisoners realized that the bravery of the German soldier, the genius of the German generals, and the will of the Führer were mathematically irrelevant. They were fighting an enemy that could lose an entire army and simply build another one, fully equipped and well-fed by the following morning. As the trains finally slowed, pulling into the sidings of camps in rural Texas or the forests of Mississippi, the men who stepped off were different from the men who had boarded. They were no longer conquering heroes of the Reich. They were witnesses to a superpower. The final psychological break did not occur in the barracks of the enlisted men, but in the polished, quiet dining rooms of the high command. The American military strictly observed military hierarchy. German generals captured in Tunisia, including General Jürgen von Arnim, were not housed with the privates. They were given cottages at camps like Camp Clinton in Mississippi. They had orderlies, they had gardens, and they had dinner parties. It was at these tables that the terrifying reality of the American supply chain became undeniable. In the Reich, even generals were subject to the tightening noose of the blockade. Real coffee was a memory, fresh cream was a luxury reserved for the party elite. But here, deep in the Mississippi woods, German generals sat down to meals that would have shamed the finest hotels in Berlin. There is a specific, recurring account from the diaries of the era that captures this pivot point. A group of German officers recently arrived sat down for their first formal dinner. They were tense, expecting a lecture or an interrogation. Instead, waiters brought out steaks. Not the thin, gristly cuts of a war-torn economy, but thick, marbleized American beef. Then came the dessert, chocolate cake. To the modern ear, this sounds trivial. To a German officer in 1943, it was a logistical thunderclap. Chocolate required cocoa beans from South America or Africa. It required sugar from the Caribbean. It required safe shipping lanes, massive processing plants, and a distribution network capable of delivering a perishable luxury to a prisoner of war camp in the middle of nowhere. One German officer reportedly pushed his plate away, refusing to eat. When asked why, he didn't speak of nausea or hunger. He simply gestured to the cake and said, "If you can afford to give this to your enemies, what are you giving to your own men?" The cake was the proof. It meant that the U-boat war had failed. It meant the Atlantic was an American lake. It meant that the United States had so much shipping tonnage that it could prioritize desert for prisoners over ammunition for the front and still win. Meanwhile, in the general population camps like Camp Herney, Texas, the Nazi true believers were fighting a losing battle against the garbage cans. The hardliners had spent months telling the younger soldiers that the food was a Potemkin village, a fake facade erected only for the first few weeks to break their will, after which the starvation would begin. They insisted that the trucks arriving daily were driving in circles, carrying the same boxes of food to fool them. But the trucks kept coming. Every morning at 06:00, the supply convoys rolled through the gates. The routine was relentless. Monday, beef. Tuesday, ham. Wednesday, chicken. The sheer monotony of the abundance broke the conspiracy theories. You cannot stage a fake logistical miracle every single day for 2 years. The turning point came when the prisoners began to see the waste. In the Wehrmacht, discarding a crust of bread was a court-martial offense. In Texas, they watched American mess sergeants throw away hundreds of pounds of leftover potatoes simply because they didn't want to peel them for the next day's stew. This was the moment the ideological dam burst. The prisoners stopped listening to the Nazi political officers. The internal discipline of the camp Gestapo crumbled not because of American re-education classes, but because the contrast between Nazi austerity and American excess was too glaring to ignore. A captured corporal at a camp in Alabama summed up the defeat in a letter to his wife. He didn't write about the battles he had lost or the friends who had died. He wrote, "Elsa, stop worrying about me. I am safe. I have gained 10 pounds. The Americans are crazy. They fight a war like they are running a business, and business is good. We cannot beat these people. We simply cannot." The realization was total. They were not defeated by superior courage or better tactics. They were defeated by the crushing weight of a society that treated the greatest war in human history as a logistical sideline. The men finished their chocolate cake, wiped their mouths, and accepted that the 1,000-year Reich was over. The final psychological break did not occur in the barracks of the enlisted men, but in the polished, quiet dining rooms of the high command. The American military strictly observed military hierarchy. German generals captured in Tunisia, including General Jürgen von Arnim, were not housed with the privates. They were given cottages at camps like Camp Clinton in Mississippi. They had orderlies, they had gardens, and they had dinner parties. It was at these tables that the terrifying reality of the American supply chain became undeniable. In the Reich, even generals were subject to the tightening noose of the blockade. Real coffee was a memory. Fresh cream was a luxury reserved for the party elite. But here, deep in the Mississippi woods, German generals sat down to meals that would have shamed the finest hotels in Berlin. There is a specific, recurring account from the diaries of the era that captures this pivot point. A group of German officers recently arrived, sat down for their first formal dinner. They were tense, expecting a lecture or an interrogation. Instead, waiters brought out steaks. Not the thin, gristly cuts of a war-torn economy, but thick, marbleized American beef. Then came the dessert, chocolate cake. To the modern ear, this sounds trivial. To a German officer in 1943, it was a logistical thunderclap. Chocolate required cocoa beans from South America or Africa. It required sugar from the Caribbean. It required safe shipping lanes, massive processing plants, and a distribution network capable of delivering a perishable luxury to a prisoner of war camp in the middle of nowhere. One German officer reportedly pushed his plate away, refusing to eat. When asked why, he didn't speak of nausea or hunger. He simply gestured to the cake and said, "If you can afford to give this to your enemies, what are you giving to your own men?" The cake was the proof. It meant that the U-boat war had failed. It meant the Atlantic was an American lake. It meant that the United States had so much shipping tonnage that it could prioritize desert for prisoners over ammunition for the front and still win. Meanwhile, in the general population camps like Camp Hearn, Texas, the Nazi true believers were fighting a losing battle against the garbage cans. The hardliners had spent months telling the younger soldiers that the food was a Potemkin village, a fake facade erected only for the first few weeks to break their will, after which the starvation would begin. They insisted that the trucks arriving daily were driving in circles, carrying the same boxes of food to fool them. But the trucks kept coming. Every morning at 06:00, the supply convoys rolled through the gates. The routine was relentless. Monday, beef. Tuesday, ham. Wednesday, chicken. The sheer monotony of the abundance broke the conspiracy theories. You cannot stage a fake logistical miracle every single day for 2 years. The turning point came when the prisoners began to see the waste. In the Wehrmacht, discarding a crust of bread was a court-martial offense. In Texas, they watched American mess sergeants throw away hundreds of pounds of leftover potatoes simply because they didn't want to peel them for the next day's stew. This was the moment the ideological dam burst. The prisoners stopped listening to the Nazi political officers. The internal discipline of the Camp Gestapo crumbled not because of American re-education classes, but because the contrast between Nazi austerity and American excess was too glaring to ignore. A captured corporal at a camp in Alabama summed up the defeat in a letter to his wife. He didn't write about the battles he had lost or the friends who had died. He wrote, "Elsa, stop worrying about me. I am safe. I have gained 10 pounds. The Americans are crazy. They fight a war like they are running a business, and business is good. We cannot beat these people. We simply cannot." The realization was total. They were not defeated by superior courage or better tactics. They were defeated by the crushing weight of a society that treated the greatest war in human history as a logistical sideline. The men finished their chocolate cake, wiped their mouths, and accepted that the Thousand-Year Reich was over. Repatriation was not immediate. The United States, pragmatic to the end, still needed the labor. The harvest of 1945 still had to be brought in, so the prisoners stayed. They worked the fields for another year, but the dynamic had shifted. They were no longer soldiers of a belligerent nation. They were remnants of a dead regime, waiting for the ticket home. When the order finally came in 1946 to begin shipping them back, the departure scenes were surreal. In the ports of New York and Boston, the Liberty ships waited again, but the men boarding them were unrecognizable from the gaunt, terrified figures who had arrived years earlier. These men were tanned, muscular, and healthy. They weighed, on average, 15 to 20 pounds more than when they were captured, and they were carrying luggage. The American authorities allowed the prisoners to bring back the goods they had purchased with their canteen scrip. The holds of the ships were not filled with weapons, but with duffel bags stuffed with cartons of Chesterfield cigarettes, nylon stockings for wives they hadn't seen in years, bars of chocolate, cans of coffee, and wristwatches. Some men even tried to bring back musical instruments, guitars and violins bought from the Sears catalog. They were sailing back to year zero. Germany was a cratered ruin. The cities were piles of brick and dust. There was no electricity, no running water, and absolutely no food. The calorie count for a German civilian in the British occupation zone in 1946 was often less than 1,000 calories a day, starvation level. The arrival of the American prisoners in ports like Le Havre or Bremerhaven was a collision of two separate timelines. The returning POWs walked down the gangplanks looking like Greek gods, robust, flushed with health, their uniforms clean if stripped of insignia. Waiting for them on the docks were their countrymen, gray, emaciated ghosts shivering in rags. The contrast was grotesque. Mothers initially failed to recognize their own sons, not because of injuries, but because their sons looked too good. They looked like foreigners. They carried themselves with a stride that the broken population of Europe had lost. But the most valuable thing they brought back wasn't the coffee or the cigarettes. It was the knowledge. They were 370,000 men who had seen the other side of the hill. They had lived in the belly of the beast, and they had found not a monster, but a machine of production so efficient it defied comprehension. They were the first generation of the new Germany, carrying the blueprint of their conqueror back to the ruins of their homeland. The return of the American. Germans created a sharp, visible fracture in the post-war German society, a division that would foreshadow the Iron Curtain itself. While the 370,000 men from the U.S. camps returned home with their health intact and duffel bags full of gifts, their comrades returning from the Soviet Union told a different story. Of the 3 million German soldiers captured by the Red Army, only a fraction ever returned. Those who did trickle back in the late 1940s and early 1950s were broken men, chronically ill, traumatized, and physically ruined by years of forced labor in the gulags. The contrast between the two groups was the most powerful piece of Cold War propaganda. The United States never had to write. It was walking down the street. On one side, a man who had survived the war eating 3 meals a day and playing soccer in Texas. On the other, a man who had survived on cabbage soup and fear in Siberia. The German population didn't need a lecture on which system, capitalism or communism, offered a better future. They could see it in the faces of their husbands and fathers. This laid the psychological foundation for the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany. The United States had officially launched a re-education program in the camps, led by intellectual prisoners who published newspapers like Der Ruf, The Call, aiming to teach democratic values. But historians now agree that the formal classes had limited impact. The real re-education was the stake. The real lesson was the fair treatment. When West Germany was formed in 1949, it needed a new leadership class. It needed men who were physically capable of rebuilding a destroyed nation and who understood the American occupiers. The former POWs fit this mold perfectly. They spoke English. They understood American slang, American humor, and most importantly, American business practices. Many of these men rose to prominence, becoming the architects of the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, that saw West Germany rise from the ashes to become Europe's economic powerhouse in less than a decade. They applied the efficiency they had observed in the U.S. Quartermaster Corps to the rebuilding of Volkswagen, Siemens, and the German chemical industry. Notable figures emerged from the camps. Rüdiger von Weckmar, who would later become the West German ambassador to the United Nations, spent his war years as a POW in Colorado. He later cited his time in America as the period where he learned what democracy actually meant, not as an abstract concept, but as a lived experience of decency and abundance. The Golden Cage had transformed a potential insurgency into a loyal ally. If the U.S. had treated its prisoners with the same brutality as the Soviets or the same indifference as the French, the post-war occupation of Germany would have been a nightmare of guerrilla warfare and resentment. Instead, the GIs occupying Munich and Frankfurt in 1946 found themselves interacting with a population of military-age males who already knew them. There were thousands of cases of American occupation troops being approached by German civilians who pulled out crumpled photos of a farm in Kansas or a diner in Alabama. "I was there," they would say. "I picked that corn. My friend, Farmer John, lives there." The animosity of the war had been dissolved by calories. The United States had unwittingly pulled off the greatest diplomatic coup of the century. They had killed the Wehrmacht by feeding it. History is often written in the language of ballistics, caliber, tonnage, range, and blast radius. We measure the Second World War by its violence, the rubble of Stalingrad, the fires of Dresden, the blood in the surf of Omaha Beach. But the true turning point of the conflict was not an explosion. It was a meal. The story of the German prisoners in America is the story of the collision between two irreconcilable realities. The Third Reich was built on the concept of the triumph of the will, the belief that spirit, fanaticism, and racial purity could overcome the laws of physics and economics. The United States responded with the triumph of the supply chain. For the young German soldier stepping off the train in Texas or Mississippi, the war did not end when he surrendered his rifle. It ended when he picked up his fork. In the steam of a hot dinner, the lie of the Nazi regime evaporated. He realized that he had been fighting a war against a force of nature, a nation that could project industrial abundance across an ocean while simultaneously fighting on two other continents. This strategy of abundance had a legacy that outlasted the war itself. Had the United States chosen vengeance? Had they starved these men as the Soviets did? The history of Europe would look very different today. Instead, they sent back an army of witnesses. 370,000 men returned to the ruins of Germany carrying the most dangerous idea of all, that their enemy was not a monster, but a model. They rebuilt their nation with the muscle mass they gained in American camps. They constructed a democracy on the foundation of the decency they experienced in American fields. In the end, the steak dinners, the white bread, and the chocolate cake were not just food. They were the most effective weapon the Allies ever deployed. They didn't just break the Wehrmacht's body, they conquered its mind, and in doing so, they turned a bitter enemy into an enduring friend. The Golden Cage proved a timeless truth of warfare. You can defeat an enemy with bullets, but you can only win the peace with bread.